Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a great privilege and an honor. So I will present today some ongoing research that hopefully is soon ready to be prepared and sent off to a journal. This is in collaboration with some colleagues at the European Commission, at the European Investment Bank, and also at Universitat Rovira i Virgili in Spain. Any comments that you have, you can write them in the chat window, or else put them into the microphone. You can speak them at any time. Please don't be shy. Okay, so this work looks at capacity constraints as a trigger for high growth, evidence, and policy implications. So obviously leaning towards the public policy side, given that many of the co-authors are from the European Commission or European Investment Bank. Okay, so as we know, there is a lot of policy interest in high growth firms. Here we have two recent publications from the World Bank and from the European Commission about high growth firms. Both of them are quite long publications looking at different stylized facts, different policy options, demographic facts, policy measures, and so on. So why is there so much policy interest in high growth firms? No doubt because high growth firms have a disproportionately large economic impact. So they create a huge share of the jobs in any period. The problem is, though, that high growth firms, high growth enterprises are difficult to predict. It's hard to say in advance which firms will become high growth enterprises. And part of the problem is that high growth status, high growth enterprise status, is not a fixed trait of firms. It's something that comes and goes. It's a temporary episode. It's a stage through which firms pass. And it's quite unlikely that firms can continue to be high growth firms for a prolonged period. So the question we ask here is, can policy nudge potential high growth enterprises into rapid growth? Can potential sleeping gazelles be pushed into rapid growth? Are there trigger points that are certain decision points where firms can be pushed into a period or nudged into a period of rapid growth? Okay, so the contributions of this line of research are several. Prominent is what we call the fork in the road hypothesis. This is a hypothesis where we suggest that firms get to a certain point in their development. It's a decision point, it's a fork in the road. They can either decide to grow, or else they can decide to stick to business as usual, business as normal. So they can either choose to invest massively in further growth, or else they continue at the same scale, and there's not really a middle path. So it's a decision point, either they go one way or the other. That's the hypothesis that we investigate, drawing on theory from Penrose's resource-based view. Okay, so we look at some, on the empirical side, we look at survey data on capacity utilization levels. So how are firms using their available capacity? And this is done amid a relative paucity of evidence. There is not that much evidence out there regarding capacity utilization. We use rich data coming mainly from the EIBIS survey, the European Investment Bank Innovation Survey, and also ORBIS. ORBIS is a well-known data set from Bureau van Dijk. And we have a rich set of results on the antecedents, on the characteristics, and also the consequences of operating above maximum capacity. So let's go back to a stylized fact about firm growth. This is the heavy-tailed growth rate distribution. So here we have growth rates along the horizontal axis, and we have a logarithmic vertical axis. This is the probability or the frequency. And then we have a tent-shaped distribution on these semi-logarithmic axes. The tent shape corresponds to the Laplace distribution. This means that most firms have a growth rate around here, close to 0. Most firms don't grow very much. They have a growth rate close to 0. Nevertheless, given the shape of this distribution, you do have some firms that are growing extremely fast down at the right tail of the distribution. So this Laplace distribution, this particular tent-shaped distribution, has been found in many different sectors, in different countries, in different years. It's a very reliable, stylized fact. And compared to the normal distribution, there are two main differences. One is that you get more of the weight of the distribution around the center. So more firms having 0 growth than what you'd find with a normal distribution, and also more firms having extreme growth rates, so extremely fast growth or extremely fast negative growth. Okay, so what this means is that growth is not a smooth process, but occurs in lumps, bumps, and jumps. And also most firms don't grow, although some firms grow a lot. When they do grow, they grow a lot. Okay, so our question is, can rapid growth be triggered? Are there certain points where growth can be switched on? Let me get rid of this drawing. Okay, so Penrose, in her famous book on firm growth, The Theory of the Growth of the Firm, talks about firms as bundles of lumpy discrete resources. So these are resources that are indivisible. Either you have the resource or you don't. You can't get half a resource. You can't get 1.5 resources. You have to have either one unit of it or nothing. And because of this lumpy nature of the resources, the configuration of these resources inside a firm provides the impetus and also the direction of further growth. So if, for example, you have one building for your factory, you have one machine, you have one product, then you can't introduce, you can't go from having 1.5 machines, you can't have 1.2 buildings, you have to go all or nothing. This is the idea. You have to have an integer number of units because you can't do things in halves. So this is the idea behind lumpy discrete resources, and this has certain implications for firm growth and for investment dynamics. Okay. In particular, growth is easier when there is slack throughout the organization. So when there is a bit of slack to absorb the extra workload from incorporating new resources. For example, adding one employee is difficult for firms at a critical state of full utilization of capacity. So if you don't have any spare capacity to supervise and train a new employee, then adding one employee is going to be much more difficult than if you're operating below capacity. Here is one illustration of the idea coming from an article in 2012 in the Eastern Economic Journal. So we have production workers at the bottom level, we have supervisors at the upper levels, and there is a certain span of control, this parameter, a span of control alpha equals to 3, according to which each person can supervise 3 production workers. And if there's another production worker that comes along, that's when you need to hire a new supervisor who will have the capacity to take on this extra workload of supervising. So of course, here the number is assumed to be 3 for the span of control. You can change that number if you want, but the main idea still remains that there is some kind of, there are limits on the availability of other resources in the organization. So let's have a look at this model in a bit more detail. what we're saying is that the marginal costs of growth are not constant. So in some cases, you can add a production worker, and this is fine because there's a supervisor who is available, who has the time and the energy to supervise this new hire. In other cases, though, if you hire another production worker, then you're going to have to hire a new supervisor because there's not enough slack in the system to absorb the extra workload that comes from adding a new production worker. So when you add a new worker, you actually need to have a certain amount of office space, you need desk space, you need space on the machines, you need the capacity in the administrative department, a supervisor, and so on. If there's not enough slack in the system, then maybe you will have to undertake broad-based investment in many areas at the same time. So in some cases, adding a production worker is quite simple. In other cases, you need to invest in further capacity. So that's the main idea, that marginal costs of growth are not constant, and in some cases, growth takes place in jumps. So here, adding one production worker, you actually need to hire a new supervisor as well. And just in this simple model of production workers and supervisors, you can actually generate quite easily a Laplace growth rates distribution, having the functional form of a symmetric exponential distribution. And also taking the model a step further, in the context of a simulation model, then we can see that the costs of growth are non-constant. So in normal times, production can increase with minimal investments. In normal times, you can add another production unit, and that's fine. There is sufficient slack in the system to absorb this extra unit. But at critical junctures, growth can only proceed in jumps. This is where you're reaching the limits of your capacity, and there's just no space to add another basic production unit because there are knock-on effects triggering subsequent growth all the way throughout the organization. So it's kind of like in physics, the sand pile model, where you drop a grain of sand onto a sand pile. Most of the time, you drop the grain of sand and it's just going to sit there happily balanced on the sand pile. But in some cases, you drop a grain of sand and it's going to cause an avalanche because of the critical state of organization of the grains of sand in the sand pile. So in a simulation model where there are 5 inputs, so raw materials, production employees, machines, supervisors, and production plants, that's when we observe these dynamics of non-constant costs of growth. In the simulation model, there are integer restrictions. Demand grows smoothly at 1% each period in this simulation model. Nevertheless, average cost fluctuates wildly as firms grow. Here we can see average cost jumping around quite a lot, never really staying flat. Average cost does seem to change at each point in the system. Okay. So then our hypothesis is the fork in the road hypothesis, that firms come to a certain point and then either they invest in broad-based growth, so they invest in the capacity, in the corporate infrastructure, in all of the investment assets that are needed to provide the capacity for further growth, or else they just stay as they are with the same old capacity, and then because of the everyday fluctuations in demand, then the firm will be expected to just kind of drift downwards back to where it was before. And we might as well put here an inspirational quote from Yogi Berra: when you come to a fork in the road, take it. Okay, The fork in the road hypothesis then has firms reaching a decision point where firm size or capacity utilization stumbles along like in a random walk. Then it gets to a certain point where the firm has to decide, is it going to invest in broad-based growth, or is it going to just drift back to where it was before? Okay, is it going to grow? It would need broad-based investment, or is it going to drift back? In which case, demand would subside and it would stay with the same capacity as previously. So we expect high variability in responses at the decision point because firms are going to go either one way or another way, nothing in between. Therefore, we would expect that the variation or the variance or the interquartile range or whatever indicator you want to look at would be higher for firms that are at this decision point. Another piece of theoretical background refers to how we think about capacity and profits. So on this graph, on the horizontal axis, we have production per period. On the vertical axis, we have the costs. We have some fixed costs for production. We have these fixed costs, even if you don't produce much. Operating costs rise slowly, but above the point of maximum capacity, then operating costs start to increase quite rapidly because you're paying for things like leasing extra machines, paying overtime, reducing the quality of your output, having fewer quality checks, and so on. Then you have revenue from sales, which is assumed to increase more or less linearly. So we suppose that the highest profits occur more or less at maximum capacity, although it's still possible to get positive profits when you are slightly above maximum capacity. Okay, looking at the previous literature, the first observation is that there isn't much literature, empirical literature on capacity utilization levels. Nevertheless, we can mention some. For example, in the airline industry, there is interest in the load factor in airline seat utilization. So this means what is the percentage of seats that are being utilized at a certain time. Dana and Orloff, for example, find that US airline load factors rose from 62% in 1993 to 80% in 2007, which can consider to be a more efficient utilization of capacity in the airline industry. Others have looked more from a macroeconomic perspective at how capacity utilization varies over the business cycle, finding that low capacity utilization is observed in recessions. A theoretical contribution by Nikiforos is about low capacity utilization as an entry deterrent by monopolists. Pozzi and Schivadi's survey data on capacity utilization finds some interesting results. The maximum output that can be obtained using the plants at full capacity without changing the organization of the work shifts. That's how they define capacity utilization levels. And they find that the average degree of capacity utilization is 81%, with a standard deviation of 13%. Also, the 5th and the 95th percentile are 60% and 98% respectively. So quite a bit of variation, and some firms are close to 100% capacity utilization in their particular survey, bearing in mind their survey question. They also observe a lot of variation in capacity utilization within firms over time. So the utilized capital variable displays plenty of within firm variation within firms over time. And then they do a variance decomposition exercise that reveals that within variation represents between 83% and 92% of the between variation. So a lot of variation in capacity utilization over time. Other research has looked at slack resources, where slack is seen as the difference between the resources of the organization and the combination of demands made on it. So this is research from the Carnegie School of Behavioral Economics and Behavioral Organizational Theory. However, slack is usually operationalized in financial terms rather than in terms of various resources in the firm. Okay, coming now to our data. So we are merging together two data sets, EIBIS on the one hand and ORBIS on the other hand. EIBIS is an EU-wide survey of the EU 27 member states, also the UK, and some observations for the USA as well. There are 4 waves that can be linked together, 2016 to 2019, and we have over 10,000 firms in multiple waves. Investment, this data is on investment activities by non-financial corporates, looking at SMEs and also large firms. And we have some information on sector, but this information is quite broad-based. Manufacturing, services, construction, and infrastructure. This is matched with the ORBIS data from Bureau van Dijk, the sampling frame from which EIBIS is taken, so it's easier to match. This is longitudinal data. We have a rich set of financial variables in ORBIS, and also it covers many countries. It's also widely used in previous research. Maybe some of you have experience working with ORBIS data. Okay, specifically of interest to our research is this question on capacity utilization. So the question is, was your company operating at its maximum capacity attainable under normal conditions? By normal conditions, I mean your company's general practices regarding the utilization of machines and equipment, overtime, work shifts, holidays, etc. And here we have 4 answers that are of main interest: above maximum capacity, at maximum capacity, somewhat below full capacity, and substantially below full capacity. So above, at, somewhat below, or far below, substantially below. And in what follows, we sometimes refer to above maximum capacity as overcapacity. Okay. So here we have for the 4 waves, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, we have responses for these 4 questions: above, at, somewhat below, substantially below. And we can see that most of the firms are in at maximum capacity. This is about 50% of the observations are at maximum capacity, and about 5% are above maximum capacity. So above maximum capacity is actually the least populated category, ranging between 4.7% and 6.6%. The most populated category is at maximum capacity, with about 50% of responses. Looking at the number of occurrences of above maximum capacity, so trying to look at the dynamics, does it happen a lot? It seems to be a one-off event. So most firms don't have any observation of being at above maximum capacity. For those that do have a period above maximum capacity, this happens only once, and it is extremely rare to have 2 or 3 or 4 occurrences of being above maximum capacity. So it seems to be a one-off event. This is encouraging. This makes more sense to us. It suggests that the empirical data is in line with the ideas that we have from a theoretical perspective. Looking also at the transition matrix, we can see that there aren't that many firms above maximum capacity at time t. And when we see how they switch into a different category at time t+1, most of them go back to at maximum capacity. There are more that go to bit below than those that stay in above. So it's not very likely to stay above maximum capacity. It seems to be a transitory short-term event. Here we have some information on growth of sales and growth of profits for the different capacity utilization categories. So we have 4 categories: above, at, somewhat below, substantially below, and we have 3 different years available. And we can see that those that are above maximum capacity, that are the brown color, these have the highest sales growth in each year and the highest profits growth in each year. So that suggests that being above maximum capacity is not some mistaken miscalculation of how your capacity can fit to your production needs. Actually, it seems to be something that would be good news. So this is a sign of good news if you are above maximum capacity. Coming also to some analysis of profits and the capacity utilization levels. So those that are above maximum capacity are making profits. They are slightly overrepresented here. So they're more likely to make profits, whereas those firms that are making losses tend to be those firms that are somewhat below full capacity or substantially below full capacity. So above maximum capacity seems to be profitable, whereas losses are higher for those below full capacity. Here we look at capacity utilization, these 4 categories of capacity utilization, and different investment priorities for the next 3 years. So overcapacity firms tend to be more interested in capacity for existing products, capacity expansion for existing products. So this is quite interesting. So they're not looking to introduce new products. Instead, it seems to be those that are below full capacity, somewhat below or far below. These are the firms that are more interested in developing or introducing new products. So just because firms are successful in terms of having sufficient demand that they are able to keep producing above maximum capacity, this doesn't mean that these firms are overachieving in terms of developing new products. Okay, looking at the dynamics of sales growth and profits growth in the years before, so before, during, and after their time in a certain capacity utilization state, then we can see that sales and profits are high in the years leading up to being at overcapacity at time 0. Nevertheless, after being at overcapacity, that's when their performance goes back to normal. Okay, so here at time t=0, that's when firms are put into particular capacity utilization states. And then we can see how things evolve. Sales and profits are generally high in the years leading up to overcapacity, but this doesn't continue afterwards. For employment growth, however, things are a bit different. Employment growth is always higher. It's higher before, it's higher during the time of overcapacity, and it's also higher afterwards. So firms at overcapacity these are the firms that are creating the jobs. Also, they seem to be creating good quality jobs because wage growth is also higher for almost all of the period. Okay. Looking at employment growth from T to T plus 3, here we have another perspective on overcapacity firms, on capacity utilization and employment growth, and we can see that those above maximum capacity have higher average employment growth T to T plus 3 when we look at, for example, the mean or the overall distribution, although not when we look at the median. Okay, here we have some graphs on total investment for different capacity utilization categories. So total investment over here on the left, total investment decreases after overcapacity. It decreases quite strongly, although this data point here, we've investigated this in some robustness analysis, and this is not totally reliable, this data point here. But the general trend is that total investment decreases after overcapacity, perhaps driven by cutting back on intangibles and R&D. So the reason I say this is because when we look at investment in assets that are not intangibles and R&D, so growth rates of investment in fixed assets, that's when we can see that this type of investment actually picks up. So IK here is investment in fixed assets. Okay, then we move on from these preliminary graphs to look at some regressions. These are fairly simple regressions, ordinary least squares, logistic regressions, and so on, multinomial logistic regressions, nothing too complicated, no instrumental variables. And we look at overcapacity from various different perspectives. The causes, well, not the causes, but the antecedents, those that come earlier, and also the consequences. But our results are not causal estimates, they are only conditional associations. Okay, so when the dependent variable is investment type, then we get some findings such as, for example, overcapacity firms have a higher proportion of their machinery and equipment that is state-of-the-art and have higher exports and invest more abroad and are more likely to have subsidiaries. When the dependent variable is investment type for subsamples of high-growth enterprises versus non-high-growth enterprises, then firms above maximum capacity are significantly more likely to invest in equipment if they are high-growth enterprises than if they are non-high-growth enterprises. Now, trying to explain the differences in capacity utilization categories, we see that rapid growth contributes to overcapacity. This is to be expected. So those firms that are high growth enterprises from T-3 to T are more likely to find themselves in the category of above maximum capacity at time T, and to a lesser extent for the category of at maximum capacity. So this is to be expected. This makes good sense. High growth enterprise status is negatively related to being a bit below full capacity or far below full capacity. That also makes sense. Making a loss is negatively related to being above maximum capacity or at maximum capacity, but positively associated to being far below capacity. So this links in nicely with our previous results on profits and capacity utilization categories. Also, firms above maximum capacity are more likely to have introduced new to the world process innovations. So this highlights a recurring theme in our analysis, that those firms that are above maximum capacity seem to be engaging more in process innovations, in advanced machinery, and not necessarily new product development. So that was a bit of a surprise for us. Okay, some regressions on the roots taken out of overcapacity. Here, the dependent variable is growth from t to t+1 of the various indicators of size and growth, which are sales, employment, and utilization can significantly explain subsequent employment growth, but less able to explain subsequent growth of sales or profits. This makes good sense. This also ties in nicely with our previous graphical analysis. So maybe hiring good employees takes time. This is why the effects on employment growth last for quite a while, even after the period of being above maximum capacity. Or maybe sales and profits growth are the causal drivers of employment growth. That is another explanation that is consistent with our evidence. Maybe existing employees only accept overtime in the short run. After a while, they're not willing to put in a superhuman effort to keep operating above regular work levels. Some of the usual suspects, for example, investment in IT, innovation, R&D, do not go far in explaining subsequent growth. The interaction term grants times overcapacity is insignificant for sales growth and actually mildly negative for employment growth. So this suggests that grants are currently not helping firms overcome capacity constraints, although this is not too much of a surprise because grants could be there for many reasons. Maybe they're just not targeted for these firms anyway. So that doesn't seem to be a problem. That's a minor curiosity, but we're not going to make too much out of this result about grants. Okay, the fork in the road hypothesis then is that we would expect more variability in growth rates for firms that are above maximum capacity. That's what we hypothesize. Do we observe it? We have some mixed evidence from these line plots of the interquartile range for sales growth and for employment growth. So there is some support, but it's not so clear-cut. So above maximum capacity firms are relatively high, but they're not the highest in terms of the variability of growth. And also, it seems that the fork in the road hypothesis, looking only at the interquartile range on these plots, it works better for sales growth than for employment growth. Okay, but we will investigate this fork in the road hypothesis in more detail later on. Well, now actually. So now we have these quantile regression results to investigate the fork in the road hypothesis. So what we would expect if the hypothesis is supported is that we would have, at the top quantiles, we would have a positive and significant coefficient. And at the lower quantiles, this is for firms that are decreasing in size, we would have a negative and statistically significant coefficient, meaning that the dummy for overcapacity, either it pushes you onto faster growth if you're going to take one fork in the road, or it pushes you onto slower growth or faster decline, depending how you want to look at it, if you are at the other fork in the road. So the explanatory variable here is overcapacity. This is whether you are yes or no, are you above maximum capacity? And here we find a positive and significant coefficient at the top end, a negative and significant coefficient at the bottom end for sales growth. So looking at sales, the overcapacity dummy is positively linked to growth for the fastest growers. And overcapacity is negatively linked to growth for the fast decliners. So that's in line with the fork in the road hypothesis. Nevertheless, for employment, we do observe a positive significant coefficient here, but it never actually gets negative significant. So the overcapacity dummy is positively linked to growth for the fastest growers. However, it is not different from zero at the lower quantiles. So the fork in the road hypothesis, therefore, is best supported for sales, not for employment. Maybe it's never actually negative significant in the case of employment growth because maybe firing employees is more difficult. So maybe there are asymmetries in the ease of hiring or firing employees. Maybe it's harder to fire employees. Okay, a few more regressions looking into investment activity as the dependent variable. Firms above maximum capacity are more likely than firms far below capacity to invest in buildings and new equipment. But this effect fades when additional control variables are introduced. Firms at or above maximum capacity are actually less likely to invest in R&D. Maybe because overstretched firms focus on short-term priorities while neglecting longer-term investments such as R&D. So maybe they're more focused on shorter-term survival than taking a longer-term perspective. Firms above maximum capacity are more likely to invest in training and also organization business process improvements. So this highlights the story that these overcapacity firms are more interested in process improvements, process innovation rather than product innovation. These are investments with more immediate payoffs that could help to alleviate the pressures of overcapacity through a more efficient use of inputs. And also firms above maximum capacity are more likely to invest in digitalization. This ties in well with the finding about process innovation, process improvements as well. This is consistent with their higher likelihood of reporting access to digital infrastructure as a major obstacle when we look at the survey questions on obstacles. Okay, some more regressions on the determinants of growth for different capacity utilization categories taken separately. We have a few results here, although the number of observations is not huge. Making a loss is negatively associated with subsequent employment growth for those in most categories, so at maximum capacity, a bit below, and far below maximum capacity, although this is not observed for those above maximum capacity. So maybe those above maximum capacity, maybe these firms are less sensitive, are less vulnerable. Maybe maybe their employment growth decisions are less sensitive to dips in profits. So even if profits go down a bit, these firms are still going to hire the employees that they need because they are facing these capacity utilization limits and they really need these extra employees. Okay, so now I come to the conclusions. And there are 7 themes in these conclusions. So I called these the 7 sisters. So conclusion 1, Operating above maximum capacity is not a mistake, it's not an error, it seems to be a felicitous state. It seems to be something fortunate, it seems to be something that is good news. Firms enter overcapacity because of surging demand. Overcapacity can be seen as a fork in the road, so a decision point where firms either go one way or the other. Firms above maximum capacity are making incremental investments, not wildly innovating, but just taking more incremental, process-oriented innovations and improvements. Also, our results are consistent with a co-evolutionary model where demand pushes up sales and profits and employment. Financial constraints don't seem to be holding these firms back. That's something we see from various perspectives. And then policy could focus on trigger points. So maybe there's a role for policy in encouraging firms to grow, thinking about these particular trigger points and decision points. Okay, so I'm going to go through these 7 points in a bit of detail. So one slide for each of these 7, and then that's the end of my talk. Operating above maximum capacity is a felicitous state. It's not a costly mistake of misjudging. Rapid growth of sales and profits are observed in the years before and during overcapacity, and rapid employment growth is observed before, during, and also after. Also, some robustness analysis at the country level, we find higher scores for management capabilities on average as a country level average for those countries where the proportion of firms above maximum capacity is higher as well. So there seems to be a positive relationship between management capabilities and being above maximum capacity when we look at these crude country level averages. Number 2, firms enter overcapacity because of surging demand. Sales and profits precede entry into overcapacity. This is consistent with previous literature. And also looking at some survey evidence on barriers for these firms in our data, they are less likely to report about major barriers related to demand or uncertainty about the future. Number 3, overcapacity as a fork in the road. So firms in a state of critically high capacity utilization have 2 options. Number 1, either build on current momentum with broad-based investment, or else number 2, wait for the wave to subside and then keep with current capacity levels, keep within current limits, and then wait for things to calm down, stick to the business as usual situation. So we do observe high variation in their growth rates, although the evidence is a bit mixed. Quantile regressions show a positive association with growth at the upper quantiles, and also a negative association with growth only in the case of sales at the lower quantiles. So overall, we can say that there is some support for this fork in the road hypothesis. Number 4, firms above maximum capacity are making incremental investments. So they are not radical superstar inventors in the sense of bringing out new products. Instead, they are making incremental investments with regards to their processes, with regards to digitalization, and so on. They tend to focus on capacity expansion for existing products rather than prioritizing new products. So they invest in things like buildings, new equipment, training, process improvements, digitalization, state-of-the-art equipment, process innovations, but not on development and introduction of new products. And also they are less likely to invest in R&D. Okay, number 5, Our results are consistent with a co-evolutionary model, a co-evolutionary sequential model, where first in the sequence we have a rise in demand. Then this rise in demand is going to push up sales, and sales pushes up profits. Then, because of this rising demand, employees are hired. They're hired before, during, and also after the time of overcapacity. And this kind of step-by-step sequential co-evolutionary model here in numbers 1 to 4, this is consistent with results from causal methods, although let me say it again, our results are not causal estimates here. They are just conditional associations and insights into the time trends and the time evolution. Okay. Number 6, financial constraints don't seem to be holding these firms back. So this is of interest to policymakers because it doesn't seem to be the usual financial constraints story that policymakers are often talking about. Firms above maximum capacity are unlikely to report availability of finance as a major obstacle. Also, they are unlikely to think that they would be turned down when applying for external finance. Also, grants are not related to firm growth, and grants multiplied by overcapacity as an interaction term was not significant or else mildly negative. So these firms above maximum capacity and their growth does not seem to be clearly related to grants. Okay, finally, number 7, policy could focus on trigger points. So maybe there is an opportunity here for policy to move forward in terms of understanding and encouraging high growth enterprises. So barriers faced by growing firms are heterogeneous. All kinds of barriers are observed. Policy could focus not trying to address all of these barriers at the same time, but just trying to focus on a relatively narrow set of specific junctures or trigger points that may be related to capacity utilization. Things like hiring a first employee. So this is where a solo self-employed individual makes the leap to hiring their first employee. So this is a discontinuity, this is a step change, and this could be an important step in the path of growth for a new business. First steps into internationalization. This is also a discrete, a lumpy, a decision point. It's a trigger point for subsequent growth. Perhaps introducing a second product if you already have only one product, building a second production plant if you only have one production plant and you need more capacity, investing in next generation capital equipment. This could be a major discontinuity as well. Overcoming a regulatory threshold for firm size, after which, for example, employment protection legislation becomes stricter. So in France, there is a threshold at 50 employees. If you have 50 or more employees, then you need to introduce a new part of the organization that is specifically set up to represent employees to comply with employee protection legislation. If you're size 49, you don't need to do this. If you're size 50, then you need to pay all of these costs to set up this new part of the firm. So this could be a tipping point or a barrier holding back firms that want to grow. Okay, so to help firms overcome these barriers or these things holding back firms when they come to trigger points, perhaps firms could could have a temporary, for example, a 2-year freeze on the costs of growth until firms become accustomed to operating at a larger size. So this is one possible policy implication we could think of. Okay, so I've now finished my talk. Thank you very much. My last slide has a summary of the 7 conclusions, but I will just leave this here. I've finished my talk now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coad, for such a deep insight into the nature of fast growth companies.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask you the first question. Do you expect your hypothesis to work outside the European Union?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think the hypothesis is quite broad in the sense that it will work for different sectors, different countries, different time periods, because these resources that have been identified by Edith Penrose in her theory of firm growth, these are the general building blocks of many different kinds of firms. So I think it should hold in other contexts as well.
Mm-hmm. Have you noticed anything specific about tech companies, or maybe there are some peculiarities between enterprises from different industries?
That's a good point. Yes. So there's one paper that came out earlier this year that focuses on 2 specific sectors that are quite narrowly defined, but where the relationship between capacity utilization and growth or investment is quite specific. So the airline industry, where if you are in the airline industry, if you are at full capacity, then that's fine. If you're below capacity, then you can take some airlines off. If you're above, if you're facing really high demand, then you can lease some airlines. So you can always have a capacity utilization of 90% or higher, even if demand is really volatile, because you can vary your scale of operation quite easily. You can lease planes if you need them, or you can stop using planes or lease them to someone else if you don't need them. However, in the hotel industry, you build a hotel, you have all of these rooms, and then you're stuck with this quantity. So if demand is volatile, then on a good day, then you can use 100% of your capacity, but probably you won't use all of your capacity all the time. Maybe capacity utilization will go down to something like 60%, and there's nothing you can do about it because people aren't coming to your hotel using all of your rooms, and you still have to pay to maintain these rooms. So it does depend to some extent on the industry. We can't investigate this in too much detail in our data because our sectoral dummies are quite broad. So we have, I think, 4 dummies for manufacturing, services, infrastructure, and another one, but not very detailed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, any questions to Dr. Coad? Maybe. Yes,
good
please,
morning.
introduce yourself.
I'd like. Could I ask Professor?
Yes, please do.
Yes. I have some questions. Do you study only by quantitative approach? What do you think about quality features such as human capital, loyalty, client loyalty, and so on? It seems to me it's very important factors to study for growth of companies.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think there are many opportunities here for studying, for doing qualitative analyses as well. So asking firms what are the problems that they faced when they reached above maximum capacity. Were their employees happy or not? What was holding them back? What made them decide one way or the other, facing the fork in the road, etc. I think there are many ways that qualitative research could contribute here.
Thank you for your very interesting paper.
Thank you.
I hope I use it in my lectures. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions?
I probably ask a question.
Yes, please. Could you please introduce yourself?
I'm Evgenia Bessonova from Bank of Russia. Thank you for the very interesting research and presentation. I have a question on the overcapacity and the nature of competition. I have very interesting data, and I could suppose that in this data you have question about competition, the level of the competition which each firm face. And from the economic theory, for example, all these research made by Philippe Aghion, there they connect the level of competition and possibility to make investment in R&D and innovation. Probably firms could face very tough competition and operate at zero profit margin, so they can't make investment in for example, in innovation. They could make only incremental type of innovation. What do you think about this?
That's a good point. So is it possible that these firms above maximum capacity are somehow having low profits, which means that they can't invest in innovation? So it seems that the results here suggest that that is not a problem. So these firms that are above maximum capacity seem to be having higher profits and sales in the years before overcapacity. Also, they don't declare that they are financially constrained in the survey questions on barriers. So what barriers are you facing? Are you facing problems related to financial constraints? Also, I think there's a question on competition. And there, I don't think they are too sensitive to competition. But I think the real problem is for these firms that are far below maximum capacity. So these are the firms that, as you say, these are the firms that have very low profit margins or else making losses, and also probably having problems with competition. So I think these competition factors are important, but more for the firms that are far below maximum capacity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe any remarks? Okay. Let me thank you very much, Dr. Coad, for
Thank you very much.
Yeah,